What will be presented in this video?
In this video, you will be introduced to the importance of the representation of diversity in books and learning materials for your teaching. By this, we refer to books and materials used for general education, not for specific contexts or needs. And these include textbooks, but also literary texts or illustrations, photographs, and images that appear in them, as well as media resources such as films or websites, etc. So we will cover topics such as the hidden curriculum, the phenomenon of othering, and how to develop a diverse canon. We will explain why this is important to consider representations of diversity and how this can be done. We will also suggest what you can do if you're not able to choose your books and learning materials freely. And in the end, we will present how this section is connected with other sections in the All Means All online textbook. And we will provide some suggestions for how to further explore the topic of diversity in books and learning materials. What do we mean by representation of diversity in books and teaching materials?
This representation refers to the variety of voices and images being heard and shown in the materials that we use in our learning environments. These materials, which may be commercial or teacher-made resources, contain text and images that should display to our students a variety of representations of different genders and sexual orientations, ethnicities, ages, religions, abilities, or cultures. Why is it important to critically assess representations of diversity in books and learning materials?
Our classrooms are a representation of wider society, where pupils from a range of different backgrounds and identity meet and interact. So, like society, our classrooms are not homogeneous, and therefore books and materials should reflect that diversity that is found in today's schools. But many individuals and groups are underrepresented or misrepresented in the materials that we use in our classrooms. So we should take a closer look at which voices and images are silenced or even absent, which are being heard and shown, and how are they being depicted in the materials that we offer to our students. As Rudine Sims Bishop said, our books should function as mirrors for self-identification and windows and sliding doors for learning about and coming closer to others.
What is the hidden curriculum?
Well, the hidden curriculum is a term which refers to the social, the cultural, and the behavioral messages that are implicit in teaching materials and practices, and that usually reflect the dominant culture in the context in which the materials were produced and where the teaching and the learning are situated. Now, in terms of diversity, the hidden curriculum is very relevant because it contains cultural elements such as political agendas, ideologies, and preconceived notions of gender, of age, religion, sexuality, or nationality. And these may create or reproduce or reinforce stereotypes and prejudices. For example, we can take a study carried out by UNESCO, where they analyzed 24 mathematics textbooks used in primary education in 4 different French-speaking African countries. This study revealed that female role models rarely appeared in those textbooks and that their presence decreased as the difficulty level of the book rose. And the consequence of that absence of female examples in the books was that girl pupils had little foundation for identification or for projection, and that eventually all students and their parents and their teachers perceived that knowledge was more legitimate for male students than for female ones. So these textbooks contributed to perpetuating a stereotype and are very unlikely to ever make girls interested in learning maths.
In what ways do books and teaching materials exclude marginalized or minority groups?
The concept of hidden curriculum shows us that history, political ideologies, and traditions can all influence the content of our materials. This can mean that certain groups of people are not included or represented in learning materials because they are different and do not fit in with the norms of mainstream society. In some cases, they are perceived as posing a threat. As a result, they are treated differently and may be discriminated against. This is a phenomenon known as othering. It divides groups of people into us and them. People can be othered due to their race, sexuality, religion, gender identity, disability, nationality, or ethnic background. This can lead to isolation, bullying, shaming, and abuse. If we as teachers are not aware of these risks of othering and do not approach our materials in a critical way, we may contribute to the perpetuation of such prejudices and injustices.
What can we do to avoid othering?
The opposite of othering is belonging. So it's important that we think about how to make students feel included, valued, and that their differences are appreciated and celebrated. We should consider how we incorporate differences in a way that encourages a sense of belonging whilst avoiding othering. We should also be aware of falling into the trap of believing that although we do include minorities or marginalised groups, our practices are in fact more of a box-ticking exercise. For example, there are opportunities throughout the school year, such as Black History Month, World Autism Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, etc., which are often used to teach students about and highlight awareness of social injustice and difference. Although this may seem positive, it can still be a form of othering, as the way in which we approach difference is separated from the standard curriculum. We should be aware of how we display books in our classrooms or libraries as to avoid othering and making the subjects appear separate and not belonging to the main group.
How can we select books whose content cater for diversity?
We should be creating a diverse canon of literature and materials. For example, with literature, the aim should be to widen the canon of literary texts and not to remove or replace it. One way is to start by conducting an audit. This involves counting and then analysing the amount of representations of diversity, for example race or gender, in your existing materials. For example, the number of texts written by people of colour or the presence of characters from minority groups. Using this information, we can evaluate how well diversity is represented by revealing the dominance of particular groups and the absence of others. We can also consider the textbooks we use and how diverse the images or illustrations are, and critically reflect on the consequences of using such examples may have upon our students and also their learning identity. For example, how is gender represented in scientific, technology or home economics textbooks? How are different ethnic groups represented in history books? What are the implicit messages that students receive due to these images? If you want to incorporate new books and materials into your teaching, you need to be active in your search for these materials by contacting regional or national educational organisations, activist groups, local libraries, and by keeping updated on the recent research in your field. You can find some suggestions and links in our chapter as regards to this. How can we critically approach our books and materials in order to assess their possible biases?
We can apply two complementary approaches, one quantitative and one qualitative. So to begin with the quantitative approach, we should consider the presence or the absence of references to diverse communities and identities, both in texts and in images. For example, can we find any examples of characters of a variety of ethnicities in our books? Are there images of different models of families or religious practices, or is it always the same types that are represented? Also, as regards the writing, we should check whether the texts are narrated in gender-neutral terms or whether they use the masculine pronoun and terms to refer to both genders and to all orientations. And this analysis will help us discover whether there are invisible groups in our materials, such as, say, single parents or same-sex couples, blue-collar workers, transgender people, people of minority religions. All these individuals that are part of our societies, and they should have their representation within the classroom too. And this does not mean that we must devote a lesson, an activity, or just one particular material to each of these groups, as if we were taking off their names from a list of topics to cover, and then return to our usual teaching. There must be a balance in the representation in our books and our materials as a part of a paradigm in which diversity is a sustainable, integral component and not just an occasional activity. Now, to carry out the quantitative approach, after we detect the examples of diverse voices and images, we must evaluate the quality of these examples and check whether the text and images depict all people as individuals with distinctive features instead of stereotypical ones. We should look out for stereotypes such as, for example, are strong, independent girls described as manlike or sensitive men as feminine? Are people of a particular ethnicity always depicted in their traditional clothing? Or are people with disabilities portrayed as not independent or to be pitied? Or are low-income families always depicted as passive or needing help? Also, we should consider whether these diverse characters have a central or participant role in the stories, or if instead they are just there for decorative reasons, so to speak. For example, we should pay attention to who the heroes or the successful protagonists in the stories are, and ask, do they always belong to the same social class or the same ethnicity or the same gender? In which context are they introduced? For example, are people of color included only in pieces dealing with migration or with poverty? And do characters of a particular ethnicity or gender need the help of characters from a more dominant group in order to succeed or to solve their problems? So the answers to all these questions will help us reveal the underlying biases and the prejudices that our books and materials may be reflecting and that our students are being exposed to.
What do we do if we cannot select the books and teaching materials that we want to use in our teaching?
Well, yeah, sometimes teachers are not able to select suitable books and teaching materials themselves, either because the curriculum states that certain literary texts should be studied, or because the school that they're working in has already bought a large number of textbooks for a particular course or class. Often schools use the same course books for several years, even if those books feel out of date, and sometimes schools pay extensive subscription to online material, which therefore sort of restricts teachers to use this material primarily before turning to other sources. So, in other words, teachers are often forced to make use of what they already have access to in terms of books and teaching materials, even though the material is not very suitable because they contain stereotypical images or do not show a representation of diversity. What we as teachers can do then is to make sure that stereotypical images and texts are not left uncommented upon. If we have to use a particular textbook when teaching chemistry, for example, and all the images in that textbook show people of a certain age or ethnicity, we must bring this to our students' attention. Asking questions such as, who do you think of when you think of a scientist working in a laboratory? Or what does that person look like? Do the images in your textbook correspond to the pupils' images? If yes, why? And if not, why not? And finally, what images are left out? One may argue that scrutinizing images in a chemistry book has got nothing to do with the teaching of chemistry, but pupils' abilities to engage in subjects and show their understanding and perspectives of different school subjects, whether it's chemistry or language studies or mathematics, that can actually help increase pupils' motivation and encourage critical thinking. So if we find that the textbooks that we have to use in our teaching are not particularly suitable in terms of diversity, we need to add complementary materials which include information about scientists of other ages or genders or ethnicities that have also contributed to the topic being learned.
How is this section connected with other topics in the All Means All online textbook?
So after selecting your books and materials, you need to make sure that they can be used by all students regardless of their abilities and needs. So we recommend that you also revise the section on accessibility of media and materials. Also, if you're interested in the issue of diversity and how to avoid excluding marginalized groups in your teaching, the section on anti-bias education gives you more insight into this matter.
How can I explore this topic further?
Well, the literature list found in the related chapter in the book gives you some examples of studies that have been made on diversity in books and learning materials. For example, you'll find a link to the study on the representation of gender in mathematics textbooks that was mentioned in the hidden curriculum section. And also there you'll find some useful guidelines which help you check whether your materials are free from prejudice and stereotypes. There's, for example, the UNESCO publication called Making Textbook Content Inclusive, a focus on religion, gender and culture, which offers an in-depth analysis and a guide to check whether textbooks are free from prejudice and stereotypes based on religion, gender and culture. They do so by looking at the book's employment of inclusive language, their representation of diverse identities, and their integration of human rights. Furthermore, there are also links to websites that offer also checklists to detect prejudiced and biased materials and book lists of literary readings that are diversity friendly.